Hello and happy asynchronous Monday. Welcome back to week 3 of Advanced Economy Elective, from Poverty to Prosperity. So now by the third week, so in the beginning, weeks 1 through 3, we have to do a little bit of theory, obviously, before we start talking about the substantive of political economy. So today is the last day that will be really theory based, and then we can jump on in. So today I'm going to talk about the government's role in managing the economy and the government's role in managing economic development. And you can link that to the scenario that I am about to send out to you. So the government's role in development, we're going to talk about the 3 main theories of development. We're going to define some key terms in economic development, and then we're going to talk about the difference between fiscal and monetary policy. And I have to say, those are 2 terms that I hear people using interchangeably. And I think, like, for example, if I read a news article, but I think the average person, if you ask them to define the difference, they couldn't tell you. And the difference is really important. And the difference is really important to democracy. And the best case study that every student usually knows when we talk about fiscal and monetary policy is Zimbabwe. And basically the very terrible management of both fiscal and monetary policy in Zimbabwe. So at this point, week 3, students are feeling a little bit more at ease with this non-traditional course, but I just want to put it out there. You are free to send me an email if you have any other concerns, but I plan with the idea that students will probably still be a little bit unsteady in week 3, and that I'm giving you extra guidance, and I'm here to answer any questions. So if you're still feeling nervous because of this untraditional course, reach out to me. Don't be afraid. And the best way I can describe this course is, if you are still enrolled in my course, I give you a round of applause, because I was absolutely bonkers about my marks when I was a student, up until through graduate school. I was absolutely crazy about them. I used to get so worked up about them. And first, I don't think it really made any difference, me having anxiety about my grades. I don't think it made my grades better that I was anxious about them all the time, to be honest. But when I'm teaching you, I always think about how things seem from your perspective. So I just want to put you at ease that I want everyone to do well, and I want everyone to pass, and I do everything I can to make sure every student gets the mark that they want, and not necessarily want, because everybody wants a perfect 5, but gets the mark that they deserve and is fair. So just keep that in mind. I'm very sensitive to how important grades feel when you are an undergraduate student, right? But I also, one of the reasons I love ALU is because I feel that ALU students as a whole genuinely and truly care more about learning than anything else. I think if you gave the average ALU student the chance to get a perfect 5 and learn nothing, or to get a 4 and learn a bunch, I really believe the average ALU student will take the 4. So I don't tell you that because I'm saying that I want to give you a lower grade, but simply that I just want to take a moment to acknowledge how much I admire you for staying in a class that feels a little non-traditional and might feel give you a little bit of anxiety at the beginning. I promise you'll feel fine probably in a week or 2. Okay, I just wanted to acknowledge how you might be feeling. So lean in to the lack of certitude and what's going to be in store. I promise you'll have so much fun. It's going to be so cool. You're never going to take a course like this. Stick with it. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about 3 forms of the role of government, and we don't necessarily, I guess you can think of them chronologically, right? So capitalism took root first, and then Marxism, Leninism were a response to the inequality and problems that were rampant in free market capitalism in Europe. And then we're going to come to a more modern version of what I would say is updated capitalism, which is the idea of institutionalism. But before I talk about this, I really want to take a moment to acknowledge that indigenous forms of economic networking and indigenous forms of economic relationships are not acknowledged enough in economic history. I have to say they are pretty well studied within the field of anthropology. So studying like the anthropology of economic relationships is a whole field within anthropology. Actually, Barack Obama's mom has a PhD, and she studied the anthropology of economics. So when we talk about this, I want to acknowledge that for thousands of years, African civilizations bought and sold and traded and created the world's first economies. Economy is about exchanging one good or service for another good or service to hopefully improve the outputs of both parties in that trade. So I want to take a moment to encourage any of you to do any background reading on indigenous African economies. They are complex and they are fascinating, and they are the foundation of world economies today. I am not going to talk about them because I also have a duty to prepare you for higher level economics courses, to prepare you for graduate school, to prepare you for your careers. And when I think about course content, I always weigh these two things, like to what degree do we have time to celebrate historical Africa and indigeneity versus like how much do I need to give you the information you need to succeed in your life. So for me, in the 21st century, when you are going to become global change makers, I just think it's more important probably that you understand capitalism more than you can like talk about historical economies in Africa. But I would hope that you would go out and read about those yourself. And if you want to talk about like the anthropology of African economies, I'm like here for you. But we only have one day to talk about this. And I just want to make sure that you're really prepared for the world and your careers because I want you to succeed. Okay, so capitalism is a big wieldly term. And okay, what I need us to do for the next 30 minutes is suspend the current political definitions of these terms. If it is at all possible, we can separate what modern politics has made us think about these things, right? So we think of capitalism and we think of America, and we think of communism and we think of the USSR, what is now Russia, but was the former Soviet Union. So let's try to divorce the political charge and just think about these things like theoretically in their purest form, if that's possible. So whenever I think of the word capitalism in its pure form, I think the name Adam Smith and I think of the free hand. So before, I would say, the 1700s in Western Europe, we had feudalism, right? We had kings and queens and lords, and they basically would pay thousands of agricultural workers peanuts, phrase, very, very, very little money to basically make them what is essentially slaves. I mean, you can give someone a small amount of money, but that doesn't actually give them the freedom to make economic choices. So I still like to use the word slavery because I think it really shows what exploitation. So before the 1700s in Europe, you had basically a bunch of kings and queens who treated communal land as if it was their own, forced the people in their kingdoms to work for very, very small amounts of money. And that was the way it worked. So these kings and queens, they were not the 1%ers. They were like the 0.1%ers, if you can think of it like that. So then you had the feudal system, which is within the realm of slavery, I would say. And the idea that Adam Smith put forth, which completely changed the global economy forever, is that he didn't have any like idea about this form of government is good, this form of government is bad. He didn't care about what kind of government you used. He just said governments should not really interfere in the economy, and we should let producers and consumers do their own thing. And the relationships that arise out of them doing their own thing is what should happen. And he talked about the invisible hand of the economy, which is if you just let people have their own economic relationships, it will all work out. Consumers will start buying what producers produce, and producers will produce exactly the amount and what consumers need. So leave it alone, it'll solve itself. There are some problems with that. So the invisible hand is all we need. We should have a light hand in regulating how the economy works. And he believed that this is really important. All people are rational economic actors. And rational economic actor means that all of us just do a cost-benefit analysis, pros and cons, and we all make economic decisions that maximize our own outputs or our own well-being. And so he said, because we're all rational, we will all act in our self-interest. Acting in our self-interest will create a healthy and fair economy for all. Not true. Okay. But it was Adam Smith and the wealth, his book is called The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations is like the seminal foundational text that created modern capitalism. It's why it's really important, The Wealth of Nations. If any of you do a PhD, you will probably have to read The Wealth of Nations at some point during your PhD, even if you're not getting a PhD in economics. So as a reaction to this, historically, moving up 100 years, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and Marx are like the seminal thinkers of leftist economic theory. Had a strong reaction to both monarchies and a strong reaction to Adam Smith's capitalism. And they said, no, 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 monarchies are wrong and Adam Smith is wrong because capitalism causes its own destruction by creating inequalities. Adam Smith basically said there might be some inequalities, but they'll all work themselves out over the long term. Marx and Engels came along and said, listen, it's been like over 100 years. Obviously, that's not true. There's tons of inequality in capitalism, just as there was during feudalism. Capitalism is not the answer. So Marx and Engels, so this is so funny. Usually politically, when we talk about capitalism, we associate it with democracy, but actually in the 1800s, Marx and Engels said the opposite, is that true democracy and capitalism were incompatible with each other. So if you're not going to give us true equal democracy, which we need through Marxism and Leninism, we are going to overthrow the whole system because the only way we can get true equality is to start the economy from scratch. So Marx and Lenin wrote and talked a lot about the dictatorship of the proletariat. And basically what the proletariat is the opposite of the bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie are rich elitists. The proletariat is the average everyday worker. They always use the term man. I refuse to use that as a feminist. So I replace it with the average everyday person. And they basically felt that when they say dictatorship, the average everyday person should be in charge, and it should not be obviously the bourgeoisie or the elitists. And the government has a duty and a responsibility to actively combat forces of self-interest to arrive at optimal resource allocation. This is the basis of what Marx and Engels were arguing. The self-interest that Adam Smith was advocating will lead to selfishness. And when some people in society naturally have more advantages because they inherited money to begin with, because of the geography of where they live, because they have some natural gift, right? I don't know, maybe they're math wizards or they have silver tongues and they're really good at talking, whatever. Some people naturally have advantages. And if you believe in Adam Smith and let everybody do what's in their own best interest, the people who naturally have a small advantage will then use the economy to make themselves have an even bigger advantage and will never have true equality. Adam Smith didn't believe in equality, really. He just felt that like if things are unequal, that's the way they're supposed to be. So Marx and Engels said the duty of the government is not to leave the economy alone. The duty of the government is to be a force and to combat the self-interest that leads to inequality. So it's like a form of checks and balances, I guess. Marx and Engels said the role of the government is to stop the self-interest that leads to inequality. Pros and cons, balances. So then in reaction to this, the next century, the major development in economic ideas was inspired by John Maynard Keynes. And he also agreed that the laissez-faire, hands-off, Adam Smith, total free market economy, he said it also didn't work. But he didn't think the solution was Marxism and Leninism. He didn't think that was the right solution. He said the solution was institutions. Institutions were what was needed to make a balanced economy that did not exacerbate terrible inequality. And institutionalism says that government should regulate and influence markets indirectly to avoid excessive cycles and instability. So you can think about this like Adam Smith said, don't touch the economy. Marx and Engels said, heavily touch the economy, regulate everything, don't let things get out of control, like tight fist on the economy. Then John Maynard Keynes is like, compromise in the middle. Let's have institutions indirectly and gently regulate the economy. So it was a compromise, kind of in the middle. Said that government should build institutions that cause favorable conditions for the market to create development. You know what? Let me turn off my camera because I think it blocks some of the screen. And that the best thing to do is to create the right set of laws and regulations to cause good governance, even when you have bad people. So you may have already heard me, or I just say it a lot in my teaching and my research, that the point of government is to put a check on the bad behavior of people. And that's very much like a Keynesian sort of way to view it. So he just felt that we needed institutions and specifically government organizations and government policies and government rules to kind of put a limit on like the Adam Smith-esque like free reign in your own self-interest. But he felt that, Marxism and Leninism went too far. So this is really, really important. Communism and socialism are not the same thing. We need to think of them on a spectrum. And communism is a very more extreme form of socialism. So here's the main difference. Under communism, the government owns everything. Under communism, there's no such thing as private property ownership. Under socialism, there is, how would I put this? There's not individual private ownership, but everyone owns things in the collective equally, right? So let's take a milk factory. Under communism, the government owns that milk factory. Under socialism, if there are 100 people in the country and there are 100 cows and they produce 100 liters of milk per day, each individual in the country owns one cow. Each individual in the country gets the benefit from 1 liter of milk per day. That's a good way to put it. Under capitalism, one person might own all 100 cows and those 100 daily liters of milk per day, but that milk factory owner sells that milk for either goods or money. And then the person who gets that milk saves the energy and time that would be needed to make the milk on their own. They do something else for income, grow potatoes or whatever, and then perhaps the milk factory owner and the milk factory employees in turn buy the potatoes, which they normally couldn't get on their own. So then the potato farmer has milk, the milk factory workers have potatoes, they both win. That's capitalism. Dictatorship is essentially when the leader of the country takes all goods and services to be their individual property. So basically, the entire country, all labor, all goods are their personal coffer. And then theoretically, in a democracy, the average citizen votes for their representative, and then their representative are the ones who make the laws and policies that determine all of these economic outcomes. So theoretically, we wouldn't typically say, I'm being really careful with my words. One country could not be communist, socialist, and a democracy at the same time. Theoretically, I would say there were many communist countries that also had a dictator in place. You can absolutely be capitalist and democratic at the same time. I'm trying to parse out what can coexist and what can't. So communism can coexist with dictatorship. Frankly, capitalism couldn't coexist with dictatorship. That gets a little gray. Democracy can definitely coexist with capitalism. And I think that covers it. Okay. Okay. So here are biggies. All right. So if you remember anything from what I say today, I hope it's this. And I hope you think about this in your decision making in Anakirfa. So these are really important. Actually, I should have put them in the other order. I prefer to talk about monetary policy first. So this is really easy. Monetary policy is determined by banks, and monetary policy is essentially how much currency the banks determine should be released into circulation. Monetary reminds you of the word money for important reasons. So monetary policy is about how much money is being printed, how much money is being allowed to be circulated. It's not always the same thing, right? So, for example, if too much money is in circulation, the government doesn't destroy those bills usually. They just take a bunch of those bills and they put them in a safe and don't let them be in circulation. And that makes the value of the existing currency that's being used more valuable. I just want you to think of a bunch of bankers when you think about monetary policy. But when you think about fiscal policy, I want you to think about a bunch of politicians or governments who are working in ministries or government agencies. So fiscal policy is about the policy, the rules, the regulations, and the laws that the government makes up to try to influence the economy. So this is what's so important. The people who determine monetary policy and the people who determine fiscal policy in a good country should be different. These two groups of people should work together and communicate and talk to each other. But if they're doing their jobs well, they should balance each other out. And when one person or the government is doing both things, disasters can unfold, which we see with the economic collapse in Zimbabwe. So the best example in Africa that I can think about in which fiscal policy and monetary policy were not used to balance each other out, they were just decided by one person and it was a disaster, is obviously Zimbabwe, right? Just like printing money and taxing as much as you can and not regulating how government money is used and allowing corruption, all those things. So Zimbabwe is an example of what happens when these two things are not kept at a healthy, separate distance. So let me talk about taxation and how that fits in. And here, let me go back. So taxation fits under fiscal policy, right? It's the government that determines how much we should pay in taxation. So taxation is awesome. And if you live or are from a country that collects taxes fairly and regularly and then uses them to pay for things for society, please be grateful. Like Rwanda's an African country that's a great example of having a really healthy tax system, and tax dollars are obviously used to make the country better. So one way to fund the government is through taxation. The other one is debt, but that's part of fiscal policy. Changing the taxation rate can influence savings and spendings within the economy. So typically, if tax rates go up, we tend to see that savings rates go down, and vice versa. And sometimes raising taxes could reduce government income. It's kind of counterintuitive. And for the third point, it's called the Laffer curve definition, because if you raise taxes, that theoretically reduces people's incentive to earn a lot of money or to have their businesses earn a lot of money if they feel like too much of their income is going to go to taxes. So we do see so in Anakerfa, it might be your instinct to raise taxes as a way of increasing government revenue for some sort of project. But what we do find is that works in the short term. But if you raise taxes too much, that might make people not want to work, earn as much money at work, and it might make them not want to create businesses if they feel like too much of the business's profits are going to taxation in the long term. So something to keep in mind with Anakerfa. And taxes can be regressive or progressive. So let me start with progressive, because that's probably what you already know. So in a progressive tax system, the higher your income, the greater percentage of your income that you have to pay for taxes. So this is most countries on earth. So if you earn below $1,000 a year, you might need to only pay 1% of that $1,000 per year in taxes. If you earn $5,000 per year, you might pay 2% of that $5,000 to taxes. But if you earn $50,000 per year, you might have to pay 30% of your income. And this actually, I mean, it makes sense, right? Because if you just tax everybody, blanket tax 10%, that creates much more hardship. 10% of your income for somebody who earns $1,000 a year is quite a burden, but 10% for somebody who earns $50,000 a year is probably not. Regressive taxes create a greater tax burden for the poorest people in society. So a lot of people argue that a flat tax rate is regressive in that sense. And I've also heard the argument that if you tax, what are things that like people who are low income often need more? So a good example is generators, let's say. So if you're a small business owner that cannot afford to install or pay a high electricity bill per month, and you think you can get by with just generators to give the electricity that your business needs here and there, if there's a high tax on generators, somebody would argue that's regressive in the sense that that creates a high tax burden for a poor person who can't afford to have electricity installed and pay for the electricity every month. So we're going to watch this quick video on whether or not we should tax the rich more, because it's not easy. So what we find is that when you tax the rich too much, it has domino effects on the rest of the economy that can actually end up hurting everybody. So anyway, just watch the video and let me know what you think about the idea of just taxing the rich more.
Everyone depends on hospitals, roads, police, and schools. But they're expensive, and governments across the world are feeling the pinch. So how can we continue in the future to afford good quality public services. Why has pressure on public services increased? Populations are aging. As the number of retirees grows, working people are going to have to pay more taxes to support them. And as healthcare technology improves, the cost of healthcare is also going to rise. But where to find the cash? Basically, governments can tax three things: income, consumption, or wealth. It's not your imagination. Income taxes really have been increasing over the past 50 years. The evidence shows that taxes on income, including corporation tax, discourage people from working. Countries with low income taxes, such as the UK, tend to have stronger economic growth. Second, consumption. This is things like sales tax in America or value-added tax on purchases in Europe. One problem with consumption taxes is that they hit poorer people hardest, who spend more of their income on day-to-day expenses. Third, we have wealth taxes. This could be a better idea than taxing income or consumption. This is partly because it places a higher levy on the things that rich people have, such as property and investments. Some economists advocate something called a land value tax. And this is basically where you tax the value of plots of land. And this could raise a lot of money. A land value tax has very few unintentional bad consequences. The problem is that taxing wealth is not politically easy. Homeowners, for instance, are going to be furious if they're asked to pay higher property taxes. But if people want good government services, it's going to need money. Taxes on wealth are always unpopular, but sooner or later, governments are going to have to bite the bullet.
Okay, so as I hope the video showed you, when you're making your decisions in Anakirfa, and when you think about life as a whole, it's not so easy to just raise taxes. There's unintended consequences. It's very, very sticky, and it's very political, and there's a reason why it's very political. So we have to think very carefully about the tax decisions we make. So, okay, so taxation, when we talk about taxation, we typically put it under fiscal management. And I'm talking first about monetary management. So as I already mentioned, monetary management is just pretty much like the control of how much money is in supply, and it typically tends to be decided by banks. So most countries on Earth have their own, your country might call it something different, like Reserve Bank or National Bank, which decides on the amount of money that should be in supply at any given time. And in most countries, the Reserve Bank is independent from elective governments, and it needs to be. So the Reserve Bank is supposed to tell elected governments when their economic decisions are bad. And they usually make their decisions about how much money should be in supply based on the CBR rate, and also based on the sale and purchase of bonds. So the CBR rate is the central bank rate, but don't worry about it. It doesn't matter that's like higher level political economy, and it doesn't matter for our simulation. So then the Reserve Bank also manages the Impossible Trinity. And in economics, when we talk about the Trinity, we're really talking about free capital mobility, monetary autonomy, and the exchange rate management. So we also call this the Trilemma, which is a play on the idea of a dilemma. A dilemma has two problems. A trilemma has three problems. And the Trilemma basically states that it is impossible to have all three of the following things at the same time. The first is a fixed foreign exchange rate. The second is free capital movement. Like you can think of it as like free border trade. And the third is an independent monetary policy. At every moment, pretty much at least one of those three things has to be very, very tightly controlled. So when we think, again, like when we think about fiscal policy, I want you to think about government people and politicians. And they basically, you can think about the Treasury as the government's bank account. the government's savings account is a good way to put it. And what we find is the way that the government spends from its treasury or its savings account can have a negative, neutral, or positive effect. And it can have those three effects either in the short term or in the long term. So, for example, a great example would be something like a government builds a giant railroad. I'm thinking about this because the Chinese are currently working with the Sudanese to build a giant railroad across North Central Africa. And so in the immediate, you're using up a lot of money in your treasury, right? So that would be an immediate loss. However, so if you measure that in the first year, that's a negative. However, if you measure it 5 years down the line, once that railroad is built, if you can now increase your economic activity, export and import, then in 5 years down the road, building a railroad could have a positive effect. And that's a question of how you decided to use government treasury money. So,
I wish I knew what money.
So here is a short video which I would hope would give to reinforce and review the difference between monetary and fiscal policy. And in Anna Kirfa, if you are a member of, say, domestic business interests, you would be very interested in influencing political parties' decisions about fiscal policy. You could also, it would probably be harder, but you could try to influence banking decisions about monetary policy. So something to keep in mind. Labor union members, do you think that you have the capacity to influence the ruling party's decision about fiscal policy? Also something for you to keep in mind.
I wish I knew what monetary and fiscal policy were, but I'm too embarrassed to ask. When it comes to influencing economic growth in a country, the authorities are considered to have two main levers. These are monetary policy and fiscal policy. Monetary policy is managed by central banks who aim to meet economic goals set by governments. They do this by influencing the amount of money circulating in the economy. For example, most central banks, including the Bank of England, are asked to target a specific level of inflation. This is usually around 2%. By the way, there is no specific rationale behind the 2% target. It's just generally viewed to be roughly the right amount of inflation for most developed economies. The central bank influences the cost of borrowing by raising or cutting interest rates or printing money to buy government bonds and other assets. In theory, when it's cheaper to borrow money and less rewarding to save, people and companies will invest and spend more. That boosts growth, which should eventually drive up inflation. If inflation gets too high, the central bank raises interest rates. That raises the cost of borrowing and encourages saving over consumption, which should slow growth and choke off inflation. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, refers to the tools used by governments to influence the economy. Governments can raise and lower taxes. They can also direct spending at specific industries or groups of people. Fiscal policy is more targeted and arguably more powerful than monetary policy, but clearly it is also more political. It creates winners and losers in a much more explicit manner than monetary policy. One core feature of economic management in the late 1990s and the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis was an increasing reliance on monetary policy to smooth over ups and downs in the economy. In effect, governments delegated macroeconomic management to their central banks. Nobody really complained because most economies seemed to be pottering along merrily. However, the 2008 financial crisis shattered that illusion. Since then, economic growth has been weak, while at the same time, soaring asset prices have fueled a perception of growing inequality. Faith in monetary policy has been eroded. Meanwhile, fiscal policy, such as subsidizing wages, is now being used to tackle the effects of pandemic lockdowns. This is likely to last long beyond COVID and has some serious implications for investors. To learn more about this huge political and economic shift, subscribe to Money Week magazine.
So I like that the video mentioned COVID because, as an aside, I would say a major debate right now in the economic policy world is if there's a couple of things. If a lot of you might remember when COVID first started, let me just at least say for Rwanda, there was, I think, at least a 3-month suspension of collecting rent from people because we were in lockdown I would say, I think it was like March and April 2020. And I remember that people, at least people who, lived at or around the poverty line, the government told homeowners to not collect rent from them because if people are not allowed to leave their house to go earn money, how can they possibly pay rent? And the Rwandan government didn't want, families to end up homeless. So that leads to part of like the bigger question that's going on right now in the age of COVID. How should COVID impact fiscal policy decisions and monetary policy decisions? So in the age of COVID, when people are losing their jobs and businesses are closing and a lot of people are earning less than they ever have before, should we be having a COVID era taxation policy? Do we need to change our tax brackets to accommodate all of the newly unemployed people who are suffering because of COVID? The next question they are asking is, would changing the amount of money supply in circulation during COVID have an impact on poverty and economic outcomes during this time? COVID is considered an economic shock or an economic stressor. Those are the terms that economists use. During COVID, do we need to here's the other issue. A good way to boost employment rates when you have an economic shock is to create a major national infrastructure project. I already gave you an example of a railroad, for example. But during COVID, our traditional ways of raising employment and boosting an economy, say creating a major development project, what if that, yes, creates jobs for now, lowers unemployment rates for now, but it spreads COVID further? So then you've basically fixed an immediate problem, which is grinding poverty and people having no income right now. But if you're spreading COVID more through that project, are you just making COVID last even longer? So this debate about monetary and fiscal policy, it really has like a COVID dynamic now, which is really interesting because a lot of the reactions we have to poor economic outcomes require people to get together to create jobs, which obviously is sticky right now. So I would like for you to think about, we're not deep into enough Anna Kirfa, but you'll think about this later. Think about your home country. And based on what I just talked about, do you think your home country has done a good or a bad job in monitoring the amount of currency in circulation? Has your country done a good or a bad or maybe a mixed job in its taxation policy and its taxation brackets? Has your country done a good, a poor, or perhaps a mixed job at major infrastructure projects that would change the economy? And all of these questions that we've talked about today. And then you have to think about kind of what are the short-term and the long-term ramifications. Are those ramifications positive, negative, or neutral? So those are kind of the issues we're going to talk about. And I hope you think about them as we move forward in our Anna Kirfa simulation.